The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not a phone call, not a knock on the door, a letter, slipped under the mat like whoever sent it didn't even want to look us in the eye. My wife picked it up before I did. She was still in her work clothes, still holding her keys, and when I came into the kitchen she was just standing there, not saying anything, with this look on her face I'd only seen once before, the day her father died. I took the paper from her hand and read it. Then I read it again. Meridian Properties Group was terminating our lease. 60 days. The building had been acquired by a development company, Harwick Capital, and our unit, along with the 14 others in the building, was being converted to short-term executive rentals. We were being thanked for our tenancy and wished well in our future endeavors. Future endeavors. We'd lived in that apartment in East Vancouver for 6 years. We got married in that apartment. Well, the courthouse, technically, but the party was in our living room with 40 people crammed between the bookshelf and the kitchen island. My wife's sister spilled red wine on the rug, and we laughed about it for months. That rug was still there. The stain was still there. And now we had 60 days. I want to be honest about what the next few weeks looked like because I think people don't talk about it enough. We weren't in crisis the way you'd see it in a movie. Nobody was screaming. We were just quietly terrified. Every night we'd sit at the kitchen table with a laptop between us, looking at rental listings, and every night we'd close it without finding anything we could afford. Vancouver's rental market in those years was something close to obscene. A one-bedroom in our neighborhood was going for $2,300 a month minimum. We made decent money. I worked in logistics coordination. My wife was a dental hygienist, but we'd been paying $1,200 for our apartment because we'd been there long enough that rent control had kept things manageable. That safety net was gone. My wife was the one who first said it out loud. We were driving back from looking at a basement suite in Burnaby, ceiling so low I'd kept ducking by instinct, and she said, "What if we just left the city?" I didn't say anything right away. She said, "I've been looking at some things. There are places out in the Fraser Valley, even further east, that are actually affordable. Like actually. Not affordable for Vancouver affordable. Actually affordable." We'd talked about leaving before, the way couples do, vaguely, theoretically, mostly after something frustrating happened. But this was different. This wasn't a fantasy. This was arithmetic. I said, "You'd need to find another practice." She said, "I know. I've already started looking." That was my wife. While I was still reading the letter twice, she was already planning. We found the house through a listing my wife's coworker forwarded to her as a joke. That's the honest truth. Her coworker Linda, who'd grown up in the interior and had a very dry sense of humor about city people, texted her a screenshot with the message, "Found your dream home, lol." The listing price was $187,000. In 2024. In British Columbia, my wife showed me, and I laughed. Then I looked closer. It was a 2-story house on just under 2 acres outside a small town called Ashcroft, about 4 hours east of Vancouver in the Thompson River Valley. The listing photos were not flattering. The front porch had partially collapsed. The siding was a color that might have once been yellow, but had weathered into something closer to old teeth. One of the upstairs windows was boarded over with plywood. The backyard was more thistle than grass. But the bones. I could see the bones. The chimney was old brick, substantial, properly footed on a poured concrete pad that extended out from the foundation. The kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. The roofline was intact despite everything. The old-growth fir framing was visible in one interior photo, where someone had punched through a wall, and it was solid as the day it was cut. I called the listing agent that evening. He picked up on the second ring, which told me this property had not exactly been generating a frenzy of competing offers. He told me the house had been built in the 1940s, had been a working ranch property, and had sat vacant for about 4 years after the previous owner, an elderly man who'd lived there alone, had passed away. His estate had sold it to a numbered company about 2 years ago. That numbered company had done nothing with it and was now liquidating assets. I asked what liquidating assets meant for us as buyers. He paused and said, "It means they want it gone." Make an offer. We offered $172,000. They countered at $179,000. We said yes before they finished the sentence. 30 days later, my wife and I drove away from our Vancouver apartment with our furniture in a rented truck and our cat in a carrier on the back seat, and we pointed east. The first night in the house, we slept in sleeping bags on the floor of the main bedroom because the bed frame wouldn't fit up the staircase until we'd removed the bedroom door from its hinges, and by the time we figured that out, it was close to midnight, and we were both too tired to care. My wife fell asleep almost immediately. I lay there listening to the house settle. These long, slow creaks that seemed to travel from one end of the building to the other, and I thought, what did we just do? What we'd done, it turned out, was buy ourselves about 14 months of very hard work. We couldn't afford contractors for everything. We hired out the electrical. I wasn't touching that, and we brought in a plumber for the main line because there was an issue with the connection from the well that was beyond anything I could YouTube my way through. Everything else we did ourselves. My wife, who had grown up helping her father restore a heritage home in Victoria, knew far more than I did. She was the one who taught me how to properly remove the damaged sections of lath and plaster without bringing down the whole wall. She was the one who identified which floor joists needed sistering versus which ones just needed cleaning up. I was a fast learner. I had to be. We started with the upstairs because that's where the worst of the damage was. The boarded window had been covering a frame that had rotted through and allowed water in over what looked like several winters. The subfloor in that corner of the room had gone soft and punky. We tore out everything in a 10-foot radius of that window and rebuilt from the joists up. It took us 3 weekends and cost about $800 in materials, which felt like an enormous victory. Then we moved to the main floor. The living room was the biggest space in the house, running the full width from the front wall to the back. Old fir floors, scarred but solid. A stone fireplace on the interior wall, floor to ceiling, the kind of masonry that took real skill and real time. Along one side wall, the remnants of built-in shelving that someone had partially removed and then apparently abandoned halfway through. We cleaned, we patched, we sanded. It was while I was measuring for new baseboards that I noticed it. I'd gone around the room carefully, measuring each wall for the material order, and when I added everything up and compared it to the exterior dimensions, which I'd measured from outside when we were checking the foundation drainage, the numbers didn't line up. The living room should have been deeper, by about 6 feet. I measured again, then again. I stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, looking at each wall. The exterior measurements were clear. From the outside of the foundation to the back of the house was 41 feet. The front-to-back interior dimension of the living room was 32 feet. There was a hallway beyond the living room leading to the kitchen, but that was only a few feet. When you added the wall thicknesses, you still came up about 5.5 feet short. I went and found my wife. She was in the kitchen scraping old linoleum off the floor, earbuds in, completely focused. I said, "I need you to come look at something." She looked up. She could tell from my face that I wasn't talking about a plumbing problem. We stood in the living room together, and I walked her through the measurements. She pulled out her own tape measure, she always had her own, and verified everything independently. Then she walked along the back wall of the living room, slowly, pressing her hand flat against the drywall, tapping with her knuckle every few feet. About 2/3 of the way across, she stopped. Tap, tap, again. Then again. She looked at me. The sound was hollow. We told ourselves not to get excited. We'd both watched enough renovation content to know that hollow walls sometimes just meant poor insulation technique, or a chase for wiring, or nothing at all. My wife suggested we check behind the fireplace first. Sometimes old chimneys had significant dead space around them for fire separation, and maybe someone had just drywalled over it. But the fireplace was against the interior wall. This hollow section was along the exterior back wall. There was no reason for significant dead space there. I went to the basement. The house had a partial basement under the kitchen end, and spent 20 minutes with a flashlight trying to trace the framing. The original platform framing was clear in the basement section, but when I got to the transition point where the basement ended and the crawl space began under the living room, I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a framed wall down here that shouldn't have existed. Not just a bearing wall, not a foundation stem wall, a full stud wall, older lumber, with what looked like a door opening framed into it that had been subsequently blocked with concrete blocks and mortared over. Someone had deliberately sealed off a portion of the crawl space, and above that sealed portion, if my math was right, was exactly the section of the living room wall that sounded hollow. I called my wife down and showed her. We stood in that damp, low-ceilinged crawl space with flashlights, and we didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she said, "We need to figure out what's on the other side of that wall." It took us a full weekend of careful work. We didn't want to do anything destructive without understanding what we were dealing with. So we started from the basement side, carefully removing the mortared concrete blocks one at a time. There were 12 blocks in total, and they came out clean. They'd been placed, not poured, which meant someone had planned for them to be removed, or had at least not wanted to make this permanent. Behind the blocks was a crawl space passage, narrow enough that I had to go through sideways with my shoulders turned. Beyond the passage, a space, not a large space, maybe 12 feet by 8 feet, with a poured concrete floor, concrete walls, and a low ceiling that was the underfloor of the room above. There was a dehumidifier in the corner that had long since stopped working. There were wooden shelves along 2 walls, and on those shelves were boxes, cardboard boxes, some of them water-damaged on the corners, sealed with strapping tape that had yellowed to the color of old newspaper. We carried them out one at a time into the basement where there was actual light. My wife cut the tape on the first box. Inside were files, manila folders, thick with paper, rubber-banded in groups, and labeled in a neat, cramped handwriting. She lifted out one of the bundles and undid the rubber band, which crumbled at her touch. The top sheet was a ledger page, columns of numbers, dates, names, property addresses, dollar amounts. A column labeled simply RG, and another labeled Harwick. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. I said, "Harwick?" My wife was already flipping through pages. She said very quietly, "There are dozens of these folders." I need to explain what Harwick Capital meant to us in that moment. Harwick Capital was the name on the letter that had evicted us from our apartment in Vancouver. The letter that had started all of this. The company that had bought our building, pushed us out, and set every single subsequent event in motion. We sat on the concrete floor of that crawl space passage for probably 2 hours, going through folders with a flashlight, trying to understand what we were looking at. What we found, slowly and then all at once, was a paper record of something that looked very much like a systematic pattern of property fraud. The ledger pages documented transactions, dozens of them, stretching back over a period of about 12 years, properties across British Columbia, sales between numbered companies, prices recorded in 2 different columns that didn't match. One set of numbers for what appeared to be the official sale price, another for what appeared to be the actual exchange of value. There were names that appeared repeatedly, RG, and a fuller name that appeared on a few pages as R. Galbraith. There were references to law firms, to registered agents, to BCSC reporting thresholds. The previous owner of this house, the elderly man who died here alone, his name, according to county records we'd looked up during our purchase due diligence, had been Raymond Aldous Sutherland, and a name that appeared repeatedly at the top of certain folders in that same cramped handwriting was R.A.S. Raymond Aldous Sutherland had hidden these files. He'd built a concealed room in the crawl space of his house and put these files inside it, and he'd lived with them there for God knows how many years, and when he died, nobody knew they existed. But Harwick Capital had bought the property. Or rather, they'd funneled it through a numbered company. The same numbered company we'd bought it from. Did they know? Had they been looking for these files when they acquired the property? Or had they simply been consolidating assets and not known what they'd accidentally let go of? I didn't sleep that night. My wife was the practical one, as she always was. The next morning, she called her cousin, who was a paralegal in Victoria, and described what we'd found without giving details. Her cousin listened and said, "Don't touch anything else, don't talk to anyone, and get to a lawyer this week." We found a lawyer in Kamloops, a woman named Ms. Fairweather, who specialized in real estate and commercial fraud, who'd been recommended to us by a retired RCMP officer we'd met at the local hardware store of all places. He'd helped us load lumber into the truck one Saturday, and we'd ended up talking about the town, the property, the previous owner, and somehow the conversation had gone places that felt significant in retrospect. Miss Fairweather met us on a Thursday afternoon. We brought everything, all the boxes. We lined them up in her boardroom, and she and her junior associate went through them for over 2 hours, while my wife and I sat in the waiting area and drank bad coffee. When she came out, her face was professionally neutral. She sat down across from us and said, "Where did you say you found these?" I explained the hidden room. "The concrete block wall. The passage," she said, "and you purchased this property from a numbered company that was, according to these records, potentially connected to the activities documented here." I said yes. She said, "Give me a week." That week was the longest of my life. We kept working on the house because what else were you going to do? Just stop. The lath and plaster in the hallway wasn't going to fix itself. My wife refinished the fir floors in the living room. I got the front porch rebuilt to the point where you could stand on it without feeling like you were taking a risk. We'd put a bird feeder out by the back fence line in the fall, and now there were chickadees and nuthatches at it every morning, and my wife had started photographing them. Normal life. Carrying on. Ms. Fairweather called at the end of the week and asked us to come back in. We sat in her boardroom again, and she told us what she and her associate had been able to piece together. The short version. The documents appeared to detail a sustained pattern of property value manipulation and transaction layering, essentially, using a series of related numbered companies and shell purchasers to inflate property values on paper, secure larger financing from lenders, and pocket the difference. The name R. Galbraith appeared to be Roland Galbraith, who was listed as a director of Harwick Capital, as well as several of the numbered companies that appeared in the ledger records. The transactions spanned properties in Vancouver, Kelowna, and several smaller communities in between. The documents in the boxes appeared to be the original internal records, the ones that showed the real numbers, as opposed to the reported numbers. In fraud cases of this type, Miss Fairweather explained, the internal records were often what investigators could never find, because the people running the scheme kept them closely controlled and, when things became dangerous, destroyed them. Someone hadn't destroyed them. Raymond Aldous Sutherland had hidden them instead. She paused and looked at us across the table. She said, "I've already been in contact with colleagues at the BC Securities Commission and with RCMP Financial Crimes. They'd like to speak with you." My wife reached under the table and held my hand. The investigation that followed is not something I can speak about in full detail, even now, because some elements of it remain ongoing. What I can tell you is what it meant for us, practically and personally. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit took possession of the documents within 10 days of our meeting with Ms. Fairweather. There were 2 officers and a forensic accountant who came to the house. They arrived in an unmarked vehicle on a morning when the frost was still on the ground and the Thompson River valley was just beginning to catch the light. And they spent 4 hours photographing, cataloging, and carefully packing everything. One of the officers, a soft-spoken man about my father's age, paused on his way out and said, "You didn't move anything." I said no. He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. It took 14 months from that day for the public stage of the investigation to begin. There were announcements. There were court filings. There were names in the news that matched names from the folders we'd carried out of that crawl space. Roland Galbraith was among them, and Harwick Capital, the company whose letter had arrived on a Tuesday and told us our life in Vancouver was finished. was identified in the civil proceedings as the primary vehicle through which the scheme had been operated. The numbered company that had sold us this house had been a Harwick entity. They had, without knowing it, handed us exactly the thing they'd been trying to bury. Ms. Fairweather was careful about our expectations throughout. She reminded us that whistleblower provisions and proceeds of crime legislation in Canada could sometimes result in compensation for individuals whose cooperation had materially assisted an investigation, but that outcomes varied and we shouldn't build our lives around a number that didn't exist yet. We appreciated that about her. She never let us get ahead of ourselves. So what came through eventually, about 3 years after we found the boxes, was a settlement payment under a provisions agreement. It was life-changing. I won't say the exact number because that feels wrong, but I'll say it covered the remaining renovation costs, paid off the mortgage in full, and left enough that my wife was able to open her own dental hygiene practice in Kamloops rather than working for someone else's clinic. We named the practice. Her name, obviously, but she made me pick the middle word for the sign. I said, Ashcroft. She said that was too literal. We compromised on the street name of the property. She's booked 3 months out. The house is finished now. Not finished. A house like this is never really finished. There's always something. But it's a home. The front porch that I rebuilt board by board is where I drink my coffee every morning when the weather allows. The fir floors my wife refinished gleam in the afternoon light in a way that makes me stop sometimes just to look at them. The fireplace works and we've used it every winter, and on cold nights you can hear the wood settle and pop, and you can smell the smoke from the chimney mix with the smell of the valley. The room in the crawlspace is sealed again, this time with proper framing and a standard access hatch. We use it for storage now, holiday decorations, the canning jars my wife has started filling with things from the garden. Normal things. Sometimes people ask us if we feel like what happened was luck, like we just accidentally fell into something. And I understand why they'd think that. No, but when I think about it, I think about my wife standing in that kitchen, holding a letter with this look on her face like the ground had opened up. I think about every night we sat at that table with the laptop and every listing that was too expensive or too far or too small. I think about the basement in Burnaby with the ceiling too low for me to stand up straight. We weren't lucky, we were pushed, and when you're pushed hard enough in the right direction, sometimes you end up exactly where you needed to be. Raymond Aldous Sutherland, whoever he was, kept those files for a reason. He put them somewhere safe. He sealed them behind concrete and drywall and decades of silence, and then he died, and the house sat empty, and a company that had done him some harm. I believe that now, though I can't prove it, tried to make those files disappear by buying the property and letting it rot. Instead, they sold it to us for $179,000. I think about him sometimes, especially in the evenings, when the valley goes quiet and the only sounds are the birds and the river in the distance and the old house settling around us. I think about what it must have taken to hold on to something like that, to know what you knew and to keep it safe, and to hope that someday the right person would find it. I found it. We found it. And whatever Harwick Capital thought they had buried out here in the Thompson River Valley, on 2 acres of thistle and old fir and crumbling porch, it had been waiting for them all along.